that I am Quam located on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people, the people of the Rivergrass, where this symposium is being hosted by the University of British Columbia Faculty of Education, which sits on the Musqueam lands, and also in the Vancouver area where I'm located. We have had the caretakers of Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous peoples also look after our land so we can enjoy the beauty of the sky and all the resources of the water. So our next presenter, Nichola Williams, is a Qualicum School District math and science teacher, and Nichola will share her experiences of creating and delivering a secondary math task based on Indigenous story work. So we have some connection between the first presentation, which focused on college, higher education, post-secondary education, and now with K to 12, more particularly secondary school. So Nichola, will take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'll just try sharing my screen here. And how does that look? Okay?
Yes, great.
Okay, excellent. So yes, my name is Nichola. I am a math and science teacher in the Qualicum School District, and we are located on Vancouver Island, kind of there in the yellow circle within the beautiful shared territories of the Snuneymuxw and Qualicum First Nations. And I kind of got started in creating this math task because I started a master's program. And it's a Master of Education in Math through UBC. And I particularly kind of piqued my interest with this program because I was really wanting to incorporate sort of more place and community into my teaching, especially my math teaching. So that's sort of, where I ended up. And then through this program, had an opportunity to hear of Joanne's work with Indigenous Storywork. And I also snuck in a picture of that book that I drew so much from in terms of the foundation for building this math task and kind of figuring out how can I sort of do it, I don't know, in a better way. Every time I tried to sort of bring in Indigenous worldviews and culture and kind of ways of knowing into my math teaching, it's sort of, I got into this position where I just sort of felt like I was forcing it. It didn't really feel organic, and I didn't feel like I was doing the math justice or the culture justice, and it just felt ugh. And I'm sure that if I was feeling that way, that the students were recognizing that too. And I was like, I just needed, I don't know what. And I think that approaching this task through the principles of story work that Joanne had laid out, I think really helped me in getting to a place where I felt like I could have a math task that when I delivered it with students, I ran it through with grade 10s, that it felt good. It felt organic in terms of the math. It felt connecting and respectful in terms of culture. And so this is kind of my experience in how I went about creating it and kind of doing it. So when I first kind of got going, I was like, okay, I want to, I need to find a story to start with, and whew, how do I go about doing that? So I knew that I wanted to take on the responsibility of finding a story that was appropriate to use, that was in Indigenous voice, that was somewhat localish and meaningful to the students here that I'm working with. And I came across a story which was, it's actually posted online by David Bodley, and he is an elder and knowledge keeper for the Snuneymuxw First Nation in the Nanaimo area, and he actually has a set of stories that are sort of designed as a cultural tour through a provincial park off of Nanaimo Harbor that is called Saysutshun. And so this was the kind of the story I found, and it is about how this island has a very unique raccoon population. Some of their raccoons are sort of the traditional coloration that we tend to think of when we think of raccoons, like the gray and black coloration, but they also have a fairly large number of raccoons that are a more champagne or a blonde color variation. And so this story is a little bit in terms of how that coloration came to be. And throughout this story, I'm not going to play it just for timing reasons, but throughout the story, David explains that there is it's the coloration is given to the raccoon as punishment. And there is it's not only for one generation, it's going to be a continual punishment. And it will be 1 in 10 of every babies that will have this coloration moving forward. And he does go on to say that the island of Saysutshun has about 7-ish, they feel, in terms of their population number that they feel are there now on the island. So it was interesting that there was a little bit of numbers in there that I could kind of weave into or lean into some math from. So finding the story was my first piece, and I really, was looking for that Indigenous voice. I love that he gets to tell it, so we can play and watch him say it in his own words and his own voice, and that it is fairly local for the students. This provincial park is about a 30-minute drive from where my students are. So many of them, when we started talking about it, had shared that they had been there before with their families. So that was great. And then the champagne raccoon coloration also periodically pops up in the news around here locally. So some of them, even before we started, had said, "Oh, I've heard of these." It's kind of so a little bit of hype sort of around that piece. So this is sort of where I started in terms of choosing the story. And then from here, I worked to kind of get everybody's story ready. So this sort of included myself having to learn a little bit about the location of the story, about the history of that location a little bit, and kind of linking into that place, and also learning more about David Bodley, the storyteller himself. And so when I started to approach this with students, we started from a position of getting story ready, and I actually brought up a Google Maps location, and we kind of virtually kind of went to the location. And like I had said, many of them are like, "Oh yes, I have been there with my family." There's a little ferry that goes over. And and then we had also noticed that the current name Saysutshun, or the original name Saysutshun, it has returned to, and that happened, I think, in 2021. So recently enough that many students and many families still refer to it by the older name of Newcastle Island. And it was an interesting conversation that students noticed when we were going through this process of linking to place and talking about that name change. And interesting that they noticed that Google Maps hadn't updated it yet. And so that was an interesting piece of conversation about, hey, there's a lot of respect in having that name changed over, and how come Google Maps hasn't done that yet. And so that was kind of a part of that conversation about getting ready for the story and just making sure that we were approaching it with lots of respect and lots of responsibility, and just getting ready, laying that foundation, getting ready to kind of contextualize where the story was coming from. So once we had a chance to listen to the story, we started to kind of lean into the math. We started with a bit of just, what do you notice? What do you wonder? From the story itself. And it was interesting, the things that they pulled out. They did pick up on some of the sort of the math pieces that came through in terms of the numbers. that David had referenced, but they also had lots of questions and comments just about the story itself. There was a transformer that was mentioned, so they wanted to know more about that. They wanted to know more about what other kinds of things in our area have been transformed. One thing that I did not expect students to, I just hadn't something I hadn't predicted, was that they wanted to practice the names. So during the story, David uses the language for eagle and for raccoon. And so when we were sharing out things that we noticed, they were trying out those words and saying them. And so you can see when I wrote them up on the whiteboard, I wasn't sure about spelling because I hadn't looked into that. So next time I'll have to be a little bit more prepared with some of the language that they wanted to try out. So this is sort of where we started. You can also see my mistake in that I used the wrong variation of champagne when I wrote it on the board. But once we had this going, then I kind of had steered the conversation a little bit more towards the math. And I set up a math task for them. So I gave them the genetics handout there that I had made, just kind of explaining a little bit about the genetic condition that creates that champagne variation. It's having to have two recessive forms of that genetic factor. So just kind of a little refresh on how babies inherit those from parents and how we can have different combinations, 3 different combinations, 2 of those which will lead to the black and gray coloration, and then 1 which will lead to the champagne coloration. And then the question I posed to them there at the bottom of the sheet was, what is the chance that a mother raccoon that has 2 capital Bs, so 2 dominant forms, would have a champagne colored baby? And how does that compare to a raccoon that would have one of each of those genetic factors, a capital B and a lowercase b? And how about if they have 2 lowercase b's, and for them to show their thinking? So they did this in small groups of 3 to 4-ish on the kind of like whiteboard sheets. There's a sample response there that students had laid out. So there was lots of different ways that students went about showing their thinking and kind of organizing the different combinations that could happen. And as they were working, I kind of circulated around and continued to prompt. Some of them got a little stuck, like they had maybe figured out 1 or 2 combinations, but then they had kind of stopped. And I was like, oh, this is great. What happens if what happens if the dad is a different genetic combination than the mom? And so there was some, oh yeah, okay, let's think through more about that. And so it was interesting to kind of see them gain momentum with that piece as well. And then once they had time to sort of do that, we shared out the different ways that they had approached the task. And that also kind of opened up some conversations as well in terms of the different ways that they had organized or visually represented that thinking. And also lots of groups that were like, oh yeah, we didn't think of that combination, or oh. So it was good to see them kind of making connections throughout that sharing piece as well. And then towards the end of that sharing, I came back and sort of had said, hey, geneticists actually have a tool that helps them organize this kind of math, and it's called a Punnett square. And so I introduced to them the idea of the Punnett square as an organizational tool to look at those different probabilities that can come out of that. And so that was sort of the math test that we had sort of, leaned into out of our story. And I think that, previously I probably would have stopped here. I kind of would have, we've done the math, we're kind of done. And one thing that was really important, I think, was that this actually wasn't the end of our learning. We needed to kind of come full circle and go back to the story itself. So once we had finished our math pieces and we had all that sort of tucked away, we sort of finished or culminated by coming back to this story and thinking about it in an interrelated way, thinking about like what did we learn from this story? What are our takeaways? Thinking all the way back to the raccoon colorations themselves, to the location, of the park and how it had returned to its original name within the past few years, to our storyteller, David Bodley. And so just kind of, all encompassing, thinking, what have we learned from doing this process, and what can we take away from this story? And is there a way that we can carry that learning forward? Is there a way that we can, share the things that we have learned today with others? And so that also was an interesting piece of conversation. Many students reflected on the name change piece, and they're like, hey, my family still actually refers to this park as Newcastle Island. And so one thing that I can do today is, go home and say, hey, family, we should start using the name Saysutshun, because it's a really important way to show respect for that culture. We also had a chance to link back to looking at the ways of knowing and talking a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge that was reflected through that story. And so that circling back piece, I feel, was really strong way to sort of culminate and kind of finish off with those connections that they could take away, and then work on practicing a little bit of reciprocity and paying forward some of the things that they had learned.
Nichola, I think we're almost time. Would you
Okay.
finish up? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect. This is it. So I was going to say my biggest takeaways, just going through this process for myself, were starting with the story and then teasing out the math, really taking the time to situate the task for students, getting the story ready, listening and hearing the story in many ways, and taking time to share those connections, and then circling back to the story in the end. Yeah, and then next steps for me is just to think about, with all of this rich work, how do you look at assessment? So that's just next steps for myself. But yeah, so I think that's it.
Great. Thank you, Nichola. That's very, very rich in many different ways. So I think, Chao Chu, you're going to maybe, about 3 minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola, for your presentation. It's really engaging, and I really love how you embed the story throughout the activity, and how you deepen the idea and connect them to the math and indigenous and the land. And yeah, so thank you so much. Do you have any questions to Nicola that you could put in the chat, or raise your hand, or just unmute? Yeah, Nicola, I'm wondering, do you have any strategies that you could share with us, how you pick up these stories? You mentioned, you looked online, and luckily we found it, and we can find a video, and we are careful, and we are very aware of what happened around us. We find it in the newspaper. What are the strategies that you were picking up?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it involved a little bit of luck. I really wanted to, make sure that the story that we were using was authentic, and something that really shared voice. And so I originally actually thought it would probably be something published, more storybook related. And just when I happened to start doing a little bit of online research, up came some of these stories that David Bodley had recorded online. And they're actually it's from a little series that he's made as a cultural tour for Saysutshun as a provincial park. So you can sort of load it up on your device while you're visiting, and you can go to different spots on the island, and you can listen to the Snuneymuxw stories of different pieces that are there. So really it was kind of luck that I stumbled into it when I started researching. And then just to make sure that, I didn't really know much about David Bodley before I had come across it. So doing just a little bit of research to make sure, is this an authentic voice from Nanaimo that's coming through? And yeah, he has a whole bio page on the BC Royal Museum site for a lot of work that he has done there in terms of cultural work as well. So yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer because it was a little bit of luck, but yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, well, it's good that we have luck, and it's good that we pay attention to our lives, and yeah, we treat it with respect and caring and everything. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, do we have any other questions or comment?
Perhaps then I don't see any. Um, uh, I want to raise my hands in the deepest respect and thanks, to Mateo, to Keshish, and Nichola for showing us and engaging in the power of Indigenous stories, the traditional stories, the life experience stories that actually connect very well to math learning, and show the interrelatedness and when, the possibility of bringing these together in ways that are meaningful to ensure that there's ethical ways of working with the story, thinking about the history, the context, and then engaging learners. So they're very much a part of the experience and where they can share what stories mean to them. It's just marvelous, and I'm appreciative that you were able to draw upon Indigenous storywork principles and to think about being story ready, and then to also think about, also circling back or continuing to return to the stories, whether they're the personal lived stories, or the traditional stories that they then become a part of our learning, and it's a shared experience between the teacher, the educator, and the student. So it's a very powerful learning, teaching approach. So thank you very much for that.